All right, I'm being prompted to move into a question-answer session.
All right.
So I think there'll be a microphone coming around, and will please limit yourselves to a question, not a counter-seminar or a counter-comment, and identify yourselves, please, as you ask these questions.
Yes, hi, thank you. My name is Adrian Di Giovanni. I lead the law and development work at IDRC, and also was a kind of former student of Sujit, so it's very good to see. I also got the impression at one point you were trying to reduce group rights at certain points to individual rights,
Right.
or at least a failure to protect it.
Yeah.
Them. And I'm wondering whether that might actually be a useful way, instead of seeing these rights in conflict as part and parcel of a larger project. And the one example I have is around pastoral lands and land rights, which you briefly met.
Right.
Because the common mantra is internationally protect individual land plots. It doesn't work in large part because of huge problems in protecting individual rights, let alone as groups.
Right.
We're trying to support groups to get community-wide recognition, which you can do under certain legislation in different countries, and even recognized now in the Kenyan Constitution. So it's a group right, the community gets together.
Right.
What we find, this is initial results, is the process to get to the point to recognize a community right, one plot, a whole community, requires basic governance processes around natural resource management.
Sure.
And it also improves it as a result. So women participate more in community meetings, which they'd never done before. So, I mean, I think this may be echoing some of the concerns you said before, that it becomes about political line drawing, economic interest, where there's a failure also of basic individual civil liberties, if you want, especially around equality.
Right.
Comment?
Not really. I mean, it's a terrifically interesting point. I mean, you know, I guess that, you know, let me just say a couple of things. And the first is that I think, you know, issues about land and access to pastoral land, and particularly when you have IDPs, right? So in Sri Lanka, you know, there's huge issues with IDPs and what happens when they want to basically sustain themselves on land that's been used by other groups for a very long time. Kind of gives rise to ethnic conflict that is really about kind of basic material survival and being able to have a basic minimum level of economic well-being. So I think that's kind of what that's my reaction to what you're saying. In terms of in terms of the way to operationalize that right, I think that's a kind of an empirical question, you know, and so that, you know, your experience is more than mine. So I would say that, you know, that's very interesting, and thanks for that.
If I could just add to that, I mean, I think the point you make about individual rights feeding into group rights and protecting group rights, I think is an important one. I'm thinking not in the context of pastoral communities, but I don't know if you're aware, but in Switzerland, the process of naturalization is in the hands of the commune. And the reason for that is quite simply that once you become a member of the commune, you're entitled to produce from the commons. And so the commune must accept you and naturalize you in order for you to then attain survival. So, you know, there are sort of other examples that one can quote. Sorry, please go ahead. Here at the front of the room, lady here.
Hi, my name is Timreez, and I'm sorry I don't have a question, but I do have a point of contention. I'm from Pakistan, and the comment you made about language being the key reason for partition, I'm sorry, but I disagree with that. Because I understand language was part of the issue, but if language was the only issue, we wouldn't have had a West Pakistan and East Pakistan, because the only thing that we have in common is religion. And that was the main driver of partition. Language politics still plays a very important role in the region, particularly in Pakistan. But the identity issue is very, very heavily, in my opinion, and the way we as Pakistanis view it, is religion. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I would just raise that as a point of contention, being a Pakistani.
Sure. But although I think Sujit, if I might, I think Sujit was talking about not about partition, but about the breakup of Pakistan in '71.
Yeah, I was talking about that.
He was talking about 71, not 47.
I mean, you know, Urdu was the official language of Pakistan. It was only spoken by 9% of Pakistanis. Bengalis were a majority of Pakistanis. They weren't allowed to form the government. They were excluded from senior positions in the military. There was one Bengali prime minister. And moreover, and there was no sense in which Bengali was going to be given official language status. And that was a huge source of grievance in East Pakistan. So I think in terms of the breakup of Pakistan, I think I'm in pretty confident ground about that. In terms of the point about Pakistan that I think is also worth broadening out is that sometimes majorities can also mobilize for group rights. So if you think about Belgium and the Flemish and the kind of reconfiguration of Belgium from a very centralized unitary state that was a constitutional monarchy into something that's federalism of a sort. In a sense, it's much more decentralized than I think we would be accustomed to even in Canada. So it has been driven in part by Flemish nationalism in the north, centered in a majority population that pushed back against kind of a francophone or a French nation-building project led by an elite that was not Flemish-speaking. And so there's ways in which these assertions of group rights aren't always minorities, right? Majorities in certain contexts can assert them as well.
Sorry, there's a lady here already.
Hi, my name's Natalie Brender. I'm a freelance writer. Your talk posited two different kinds of, for shorthand, false consciousness behind the failure to recognize that the substratum of political and economic issues is really what's going on in talk of group rights. One is that Canadian and Swiss experts arrive with their lens, but the other thing you mentioned was that leaders within these countries pose the claims using the language of identity issues when really what's at stake are the other. So my question to you is what's going on in those cases when the leaders are talking about cultural identity issues? And secondly, how can addressing them at a constitutional, political, economic level address that sort of the remainder of the fervor that I guess you'd want to call it that's been whipped up in the name of culture?
Yeah, there's Marx again, right? False conscious. I mean, so they're not going to let me back into the States. So in response to your first question, I don't really know, right? Because I don't understand how if economic marginalization, economic grievances are ultimately at the motivator and the raw material that political entrepreneurs can seize upon and drive toward political success. The identity's role is as glue, as additional support, as meta-narrative, as justification to other audiences. It's always present. The identity talk is always present. It's not that, and in some cases, it might matter as well. So it's a complicated phenomenology, but that's kind of the best answer I can give you. What do we do strategically to intervene? So I guess, so there's sort of two ways to look at that. The first is that there is a view that says that once diversity has become the basis of division, it's very hard to get the genie back into the bottle. And that is, we don't know yet, but that's probably a fair point. And so the question is, are there types of institutions you can design in a way that can change their character or operation if politics changes, right? So let me give you an example. So in Northern Ireland, there is a rule called the D'Hondt rule that governs how seats in the Northern Ireland cabinet are allocated. They're allocated on the basis of party standing. At this point in Northern Ireland's trajectory and for the foreseeable future, politics is organized on national lines, right, between Protestants and Catholics. The major parties are organized on that basis. There are very few cross-cutting parties. There's no legal impediment to that. It's a political non-starter. In fact, the tails are now winning in the elections. And so what the effect of this rule in the current context of Northern Ireland is to basically ensure that you have a cabinet that combines Protestants and Catholics, and no one's left out. Because that's what got the Civil War started, right? Stormont, basically became a place where Protestants wielded power and discriminated against Catholics. So that wasn't ever going to be what we move back to, okay? So, but the thing about that rule is that it's not a rule that says there shall be this many Protestants or this many Catholics in the cabinet. And you could imagine a rule written that way, which says, legislative assembly members have to self-identify, then these folks, the Catholics, vote for this many seats, the Protestants vote for this many seats. You could imagine that. It's not written that way. And so there's the possibility in the way that rule is written that over time, if politics changes, the institutions can adapt to reflect a different way of doing politics. In a sense, this is a story of the Netherlands, right? Netherlands was organized in Sulen, in these it was a very segmented society around different forms of religious or secular identity. And over time, the Dutch in the 60s and 70s moved to a type of multi-party system that would be familiar to us, with kind of parties on the left, parties on the right, and so on. And the institutions didn't change, but they were open enough that as politics changed, the way in which cabinets were put together changed as well.
We have time for 2 more questions, Mr. Clark, and then one more, someone at the end.
My name is Joe Clark, and I guess my status is retired. I'm interested in your thesis that the drivers are economic rather than identity. That would be convenient to believe, because we know more about how to deal with economic exclusion, and indeed with political exclusion, if it's simply in terms of representation or representativeness. We know less how to deal with identity. And I'm afraid your arguments today, eloquent though they were, do not persuade me that the issues of identity are less relevant. I'd be interested in knowing. I'd be interested in knowing whether you think the preponderance. I'd be interested in knowing if you are dismissing the role of identity as the driver. Some of the examples you gave that are regionally based, for example, regions in India, which you know and I don't know, where there was economic inequality. A question arises, I guess, how did the people who in their present generations are unequal come to be there together? Were they there together because they were an identity? The question of dealing with group rights based on identity are extremely complex, and we shouldn't try to hide them if they are in fact more influential than you're suggesting.
So I guess so maybe let me offer, so Mr. Clark, let me offer a clarification. So I don't think identity is non-existent. I don't think it's epiphenomenal. I think countries are diverse. I'm talking about countries in which identity and diversity has been mobilized politically, and so that's become a source of cleavage or division. So that's the first kind of clarifying point. And then the question is, in those countries, of which there are lots of them, to what extent are questions of culture and cultural difference the fuel that drives a lot of claims about group rights, as opposed to material or political economic concerns? What I'm trying to say is, much more than we think. I think that to say that these are just questions, just because you have two culturally distinct groups in conflict who have different identities, who might not even like each other, doesn't necessarily mean the conflict is about culture or identity. And if we kind of take that lens, every time we go, we can make some mistakes, right? That's the essence of the claim. And what I want to say as well is that I think kind of material type concerns are a lot more pervasive than we think, right? So let's go back to by and by, even in Canada, right? So one of the arresting conclusions of the research reports published for the Biculturalism or Bilingualism Commission was, of course, the massive gap in per capita income within Quebec, right, between francophones and anglophones. And that was a singularly important moment in the 60s. And it was an element to Maître chez nous and the idea of building a Quebec state and creating economic opportunities for francophones in universities and in Quebec Hydro and in the Quebec government and so forth. So even here, right, in terms of what kind of one of the important elements that was there to be mobilized in the 60s in Canada, I think had an important economic dimension to it that sometimes we forget, right, in the more recent debates about distinct societies and rest of it. That's my only point.
The question is what drives it.
Yeah.
Last question. Yeah.
Ian Ferguson with the Canadian International Council Africa Study Group. My question is really about a Canadian example. What would be your opinion of setting aside a couple of seats in Parliament in different Canadian provinces for First Nations representatives,
Right.
where grievances are partly identity and partly economic. But where we now have a system where there are many, many spokespeople for this community, and it's very difficult to get consensus and have people that are committed to compromise as opposed to a politics of grievance and protest, etc.
Look, it's hard to know. I mean, there's lots of questions. How many seats? How are they selected? What's the electoral roll? What's the system of? There's a million kind of design issues there about how to make that work. I think a kind of a more fundamental question is, what would the role of such individuals be in Parliament? Would they be part of party caucuses? Would they be on their own? What would their role in committees be? Would they be able to serve in cabinet? Would they be critics? How would the rules of question period be designed? There's lots of these, there's a million small details that need to be thought through very carefully and thoughtfully before one then embarks upon this idea in the hopes that it's a solution for things. And as I think about the way things work in Canada, where we have strong parties that still function and that organize the way the legislature works, and individuals who are independent of the party system simply aren't able to be as effective in that type of environment, particularly in the larger assemblies like the Federal House of Commons, or thinking about my province, Ontario's Legislative Assembly. It's in a smaller province like PEI, maybe, or in the territories in Yukon, maybe. But I'm just not quite sure whether it would be what impact it would have, and I'd want to know a lot more about that before I gave a firm answer to that question.
I've just been informed we actually have a little more time, so there's time for more questions. Gentleman in the front, and then.
Thank you. I'm Bob Haig. I'm a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. I want to take you back to another area that you mentioned, Bosnia,
Right.
which I think is one of the few countries in the world which is still under some sort of UN tutelage. I was on when I was with Foreign Affairs, I was on the Peace Implementation Council for a number of years, and I observed the absolute hatred that goes on amongst the different groups. If you look at them across the table, they all look alike. If they speak, and I don't understand Serbo-Croatian, they talk alike. But they are of different religions, and perhaps that's a principal divider. They've also suffered, which is hopefully one of the last genocides in the world. One of the solutions that I keep hearing is, one, it's Europe's problem. And two is that the people that are now involved in resolving and working on the Dayton Accord and modernizing it are the ones that fought the Civil War. So you're not going to get any change until they depart. That's not a solution, but is it something that you've encountered, and is it perhaps true?
So let me kind of take the Bosnian case and kind of generalize out from it. And sir, I don't know nearly as much about it as I'm sure you do, or others in the room do. But there is this. If we think about group rights, and I said at the end of my talk that the issue is not group rights, yes or no. The issue is how. How do we design them? Do they have a shelf life? Do they kind of unwind at a point? And so one of the kind of interesting questions raised by the Bosnian process is whether there ought to be a sunset clause, whether there should have been a sunset clause, or whether there should have been a phase out of some sort. And there's other examples, right? In South Africa, for example, under the 93 Constitution, there was a transitional power-sharing government where you had President de Klerk becoming Vice President de Klerk under President Mandela, and that was a way to underwrite peace. And that dropped out in the 96 Constitution, but there was a sunset to it. So that was a pretty short time window. You could imagine maybe 2 electoral cycles, 3 electoral cycles, shifting along a continuum from that type of, corporatist, consociational regime to something that's a bit more, liberal, if not all the way to kind of competitive pluralist politics in the way that you and I understand it. I think that the lesson there is to think about these things ahead of time. And, what's happened in Bosnia is that, as you probably know, the European Court of Human Rights and the Council of Europe's human rights machinery has gotten very engaged in trying to, in a sense, weave the Bosnian constitutional order into the fabric of European public law, and in particular into the European Convention of Human Rights. And it's been a bit of a mess, because when you kind of have Dayton kind of institutions and their legacy and kind of European courts and cases. I mean, this is a terrible way to make public policy, right? And I say this against interest because I'm a constitutional lawyer, but it's not how you should think, it's not how these things should happen. It would have been better if up front there had been some thought given to how these things could be wound down or changed, or way stations along the way in which these issues could be revisited. I mean, Mr. Clark knows we had in our Constitution a series of mandated conferences on Aboriginal rights. Now, ultimately, those weren't successful, but that was an important thing to do. To force these issues onto the agenda back in the 1980s. Or
perhaps even a South Sudan option in Bosnia, right, where you wind down the state as it exists now.
Right.
I mean, that's a possibility.
It could, although part of the Dayton logic is to promote return of populations and reintegration, and as you know, there's a lot of debate about place names, and so I'm not. I mean, that look. I mean, that is not. Yeah. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I have a question. It's on a related matter. You talked about. Oh, thank you. Hello. You talked about...
please identify yourself.
Oh, yes. Martin Sanson. I'm a PhD student at St. Paul's University in conflict studies.
Right.
And I was wondering, what is the basis, I don't know, to make a definition or to create a definition for a group? Because I know we talk about cultural groups and minorities and groups around ethnicity.
Right.
But besides that, how should we consider other minority groups, or... is it political ideal, certain values? I don't know. I'm thinking about the student movement in Quebec in 2012. I don't know if that can be considered as a group with...
Sure. So there's a couple of interesting questions. So the first is, as a matter of definition, I'm talking about groups defined by some sort of a script of identity, right? Ethnicity, race, religion, language. And so it's not a social movement, right? Or although those can become deeply polarizing, right? And deeply fundamental to how people understand politics. I'm thinking about ascriptive types of identities. And that's largely what these countries are trying to reckon with. And so then the question becomes, but there's a very interesting question, which is how does one decide who's in and who's not, which group gets rights, which group doesn't get rights, and who is a member of a group and who's not a member of a group, and there's no good answer to all these questions. It can be a very difficult, messy process. Even in Canada, whether you can send your kid to a French school or not, well, who's francophone in your family, and these things can be quite complicated at an administrative level. One of the things that I didn't talk about today because of time is, the way in which group rights get cashed out in electoral system design and political party formation and legislative voting and so forth. Basically, the central institution that unites all those questions is the political party, and political parties are unique in the sense that they're self-identifying. People can join them or not and vote for them or not. And so rather than upfront kind of identify individuals as members of certain groups who have certain rights, political parties are, in a sense, a self-organizing mechanism whereby groups can self-identify and participate in politics as members of an ethnic group or not, right? And one of the benefits of relying on parties as the integrating mechanism is that they can shift over time, right? And so you can have different types of parties coming up, like a youth party in Quebec, right? And so it introduces a type of flexibility into the system, so that's not hardwired, and you can change as politics changes if it will.
But I think there's a very important issue that you raise in your, we're talking about ethnic identity,
right?
And that's something that seems to carry over time. Whereas sort of the sorts of groups that you talk about, which are single-issue groups, often fall apart. And example given in Germany, some of you know about the Pirate Party, which was about the campaign on internet freedom of access, and all of that, and actually rated very highly in the polls. But it was a one-cycle party, and they've sort of faded away as the issue's has subsided in politics. But there's something about ethnic identity that maybe it's primordial and carries through over time.
Yeah, or, I'm not sure you necessarily have to go that way, right? I mean, I think ethnic identities, well, look, ethnic identities can be enduring, but I think whether they are politically activated or not is something different, right? And so, and there I think, the question is, can that change over time? And I think there are many examples where it has, right? But even if ethnicity as identity endures, right?
One more, last question. Gentleman in the, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for this very eloquent expression of some of the things that I've been seeing on the field. I've been working in the MENA region for the last 2 years. Right. I'm currently actually with Canada here in Ottawa. So you were just actually speaking to political parties as intervening mechanisms.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about situations where everything is happening at the same time. So you have, these countries that have been around for a long time, but suddenly there's a democratic transition, and at the same time that the constitution is being kind of put into place, you also have political parties emerging. There's this kind of latent diversity that might be activated, might not.
Yes.
What I observe is that a lot of great organizations like the Global Center for Pluralism, Forum for Federations, there's so many great Canadian organizations, Western-based kind of democratic organizations that are reinforcing the technical capacity of governments, of commissions that are kind of putting together constitutions. And these will be sort of permanent frameworks, one hopes, that will guide, let's say, these intervening mechanisms like political parties in how they mediate kind of conflicts and bring about sort of pluralistic kind of political solutions to shared challenges. But I'm wondering, is that enough? Like, should we not also be, how can you promote pluralism at those very kind of early stages within kind of the political parties that are forming? And while they might not, most political parties that came together in Tunisia following the revolution, they've disappeared, but the people who were part of those movements continue to kind of operate and reorganize in different political parties, and sort of their values and the manner in which they sort of are constructing kind of a political message around what they are seeing and the challenges that they're trying to confront, those kind of do persist, right? So how do you change those norms as they're shifting? It's a loaded question, but I think if we don't engage with kind of political dimensions, then we're going to really, it's just as important as those constitutional frameworks.
So I'll give kind of a quick answer, which is that, I think some of the most interesting work being done in the field in the area of political party capacities by the American Political Party Foundations, NDI and IRI. They're just terrific. And there's tons of Canadians working at NDI, actually. It would be great if they came home. And if we got political party foundations started here, that would both be think tanks for parties so that we could have serious public policy discussions, and also could engage in this type of capacity building internationally. I think there's tons of expertise here to do that type of work, and in a way that's aligned with government but outside of it. I think it's important that you have organizations that are aligned with government but are outside of it, kind of a democracy table. And that's an idea that's been around forever. It's not my idea. Hugh Siegel and many others have talked about this for years. And I think it'd be a great place for us to play, because it's a good place to help. Because I think parties are often missing. I think constitutional lawyers are terrible at presuming the existence of parties, but not giving a lot of thought to how one gets a really highly institutionalized developed party system off the ground. And so it's a place that kind of makes this, parties make the whole system work. There's this hidden missing piece that makes the whole system work. We ignored it at our peril.
One supplemental point for those of us who work in the field. One of the challenges I think we face is most ODA agencies don't actually understand the importance of governance, investing in governance, because it's not something that's quantifiable. You don't have outputs and outcomes that you can quantify and justify. And in that sense, Nepal, where Sujit and I have both worked, when we first went there, it was very clear that people talking about federalism without understanding what the concept was. Political parties had committed to federalism without understanding that, their cadres had no idea what their leaders were talking about. Yet when you spoke to the donor community about engaging with the political parties, with the rank and file, training them, providing them the necessary technical expertise, or even a basic understanding of federalism, constitutional transitions, no one was willing to do that.